The airport was loud long before the sun came up. Rolling suitcases rattled across the shiny floor. People talked on their phones, and the speakers above kept calling out flight numbers. Some travelers rushed as if they were already late. Others moved slowly, holding coffee cups and yawning. In the middle of all that noise walked a quiet man named Daniel Harper. He moved carefully through the crowd, holding a small, faded backpack over one shoulder. His jacket looked old but clean. The sleeves were a little worn near the cuffs, and the zipper had been repaired with a tiny metal ring. His shoes were plain work shoes, the kind someone might wear during long hours on their feet. Daniel looked tired. Anyone who looked closely could see the deep lines under his eyes. He had not slept much. In fact, he had worked the entire night before coming to the airport. Daniel worked as a janitor at a public middle school. Every evening, when the last student went home and the lights grew quiet, he arrived with a cart full of cleaning supplies. He swept classrooms, wiped desks, emptied trash cans, and polished the floors until they shined. Most nights he worked alone. The job was simple but long. Sometimes he finished just before sunrise. Sometimes a teacher stayed late and said thank you. Most of the time, nobody noticed he had been there at all. But that morning, none of that mattered to him, because today he was flying across the country to see his daughter. Daniel stepped into the security line and slowly moved forward with everyone else. Families stood around him. A young couple argued softly about their luggage weight. A businessman checked his watch again and again. Daniel just waited quietly. When it was his turn, he placed his small backpack in the scanner tray. Inside it were only a few things: a spare shirt, a small wrap gift, and a photo that he kept in a thin plastic sleeve. The photo showed a smiling little girl with bright eyes and messy hair. She was missing one front tooth. Her arms were wrapped around Daniel's neck as both of them laughed at something outside the camera. He carried that photo everywhere. After security, Daniel walked toward his gate. The large windows near the waiting area showed the early morning sky turning soft shades of orange and pale blue. Planes sat quietly on the runway, like giant silver birds waiting to wake up. He found an empty chair near the corner and sat down. His body immediately relaxed. Working all night had left him heavy and slow. His hands still smelled faintly of floor cleaner, even though he had washed them several times. Around him, people were busy with their own lives. A group of college students laughed loudly over something on a phone. A woman tried to calm a crying toddler. Someone nearby opened a bag of chips that made a sharp crackling sound. Daniel reached into his backpack and pulled out the photo. He looked at it for a long moment. Just a few more hours, he murmured quietly to himself. He had not seen his daughter in almost 6 months. Life had been complicated. Money had been tight. Flights were expensive. And missing work was not easy when you clean classrooms for a living. But he had saved carefully, putting aside a little from each paycheck. Now the ticket was finally in his hand. A voice came over the speaker, announcing the boarding for his flight. People quickly stood and formed a line near the gate desk. Daniel slipped the photo back into his bag and joined them. Passengers boarded in groups. First came the priority travelers, then families with children, then everyone else. Daniel waited patiently until his group number was called. When he stepped onto the plane, a flight attendant greeted him with a polite smile. "Good morning." "Morning," Daniel replied softly. He moved slowly down the narrow aisle, reading the seat numbers above each row until he reached row 10. Seat 10A, the window seat. Daniel placed his backpack under the seat in front of him and sat down. The cushion felt softer than any chair he had used during the night. For a moment, he simply closed his eyes and breathed. Passengers continued filling the plane. Bags thumped into overhead bins. Someone laughed loudly a few rows back. Two men debated sports scores across the aisle. Daniel barely noticed any of it. A woman soon took the seat beside him. She smelled strongly of expensive perfume and kept tapping on a tablet screen. Across the aisle sat a man in a suit who seemed busy typing messages on his phone. No one spoke to Daniel. That was normal for him. He leaned his head back and looked out the small window. The wing of the aircraft stretched across the view, shining under the growing sunlight. Airport workers moved small vehicles across the ground below. Daniel felt a deep wave of exhaustion roll through him. He had worked 12 hours the night before. One of the other janitors had been sick, so Daniel had covered the extra classrooms without complaint. By the time he finished mopping the last hallway, his legs had felt like stone. Still, he never considered canceling the flight. Nothing would stop him from seeing his daughter. As the last passengers boarded, Daniel reached into his backpack again and pulled out the small wrapped gift. It was nothing expensive, just a little music box he had found in a second-hand shop near the school. When you turned the tiny metal key, it played a soft melody. His daughter loved music. He carefully checked the wrapping paper again to make sure it had not torn during the trip. Satisfied, he placed it back inside the bag. Soon the cabin door closed with a solid thump. The safety announcements began. A flight attendant stood near the front demonstrating seat belts and oxygen masks while recorded instructions played through the speakers. Daniel listened for a moment, but his eyes grew heavy. The plane slowly pushed back from the gate. The engines began to hum, low at first, then louder. The entire aircraft vibrated gently as it started moving toward the runway. Daniel watched the airport buildings slide past the window. The morning sun now painted everything in warm gold light. For a second, he thought about the long night behind him, the empty hallways, the smell of cleaning supplies, the quiet echo of his footsteps. Then he thought about the afternoon ahead. He imagined his daughter running toward him at the airport. He could almost hear her excited voice. That thought made him smile. The plane reached the runway and paused for a moment. Then the engines roared louder. Daniel felt the powerful push of the aircraft speeding forward. The ground rushed past the window faster and faster until suddenly the wheels lifted. The city below grew smaller. Clouds drifted outside like soft white mountains. Inside the cabin, passengers settled into their seats. Some opened laptops. Others put on headphones. A few leaned back to sleep. Daniel did the same. His body could not fight the exhaustion anymore. The gentle hum of the engines felt almost like a lullaby after such a long night. He folded his arms loosely across his chest and closed his eyes. Within minutes, he was asleep. His breathing became slow and steady. To the people around him, he was just another quiet passenger resting during the flight. No one looked twice at the tired man in the worn jacket, sitting by the window in row 10. No one knew anything about his life. No one knew how many long nights he had worked without complaint. And no one could guess that the quiet janitor sleeping peacefully in seat 10 had carried a past that almost no one would ever expect. Outside the plane, the clouds thickened as the aircraft continued climbing higher into the morning sky. The plane had been in the air for almost an hour when the first signs of trouble appeared. A low vibration ran through the cabin, subtle at first, almost unnoticeable. Then came a stronger shake, followed by a sudden lurch that made cups on the trays rattle. Some passengers gasped, clutching the armrests or gripping the seats in front of them. Daniel, still half asleep, opened his eyes slowly. At first, he thought it was just turbulence, the usual bumps that came with flying through early morning clouds. But the feeling was different, sharper, more urgent. A flight attendant hurried down the aisle, her face tight with concern. She paused at each row, quietly asking if everyone was okay. When she reached the middle of the cabin, her steps slowed. She whispered something into a small intercom before hurrying toward the cockpit. The passengers exchanged nervous glances. The gentle hum of conversation was replaced by uneasy silence. Phones were lifted to ears, some passengers muttering short messages to loved ones. Children clung to their parents, and a few older travelers clenched their hands together as they stared straight ahead. The plane dipped slightly again, and the captain's voice came over the intercom. It was calm but firm, carrying an unmistakable edge of urgency. Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing an unusual situation in the cockpit. If there are any trained pilots or former military aviators on board, please notify a flight attendant immediately. Your assistance may be required. The announcement caused a ripple of tension to run through the cabin. A few passengers glanced around nervously. Most simply shook their heads, thinking it must be someone else's responsibility. Daniel stirred fully now, rubbing his eyes and sitting up straighter. He listened carefully to the captain's words. Something inside him stirred, not fear, not panic, but a quiet recognition. He knew the tone of that voice, the precision of the language. He had heard it many times before, in situations far more dangerous than this one. He glanced around. The passengers near him looked bewildered, unsure of what to do. Parents clutched their children. Young adults whispered each other, and some people simply sat frozen, staring straight ahead. The flight attendant appeared again, moving down the aisle with purposeful steps. Her eyes scanned the rows, stopping briefly at passengers who seemed unsure or hesitant. When she reached Daniel's row, he was sitting quietly, watching the people around him. Without hesitation, he raised his hand slowly. The movement was calm, almost understated, but it was enough to catch her attention. She approached him quickly, her voice low and urgent. "Sir, do you have experience flying?" she asked. Daniel nodded, keeping his voice steady. "Yes, I was a military pilot." Her eyebrows rose slightly, surprised, but the situation allowed no room for skepticism. She gestured for him to follow her, and he moved carefully down the aisle toward the cockpit. Passengers whispered among themselves as they watched. Who was this quiet man in the worn jacket? How could someone who looked like an ordinary traveler possibly be a trained pilot? A few shook their heads, still unsure whether it was true, but there was no time for doubt. Daniel entered the cockpit and was greeted by the co-pilot, whose face was tense and pale. The co-pilot's hands gripped the controls, fingers tapping rapidly across buttons and switches. The situation was complicated. The plane had entered an area of unexpected turbulence, and systems were showing irregular readings. Daniel assessed the cockpit quickly, taking in the instruments, gauges, and alerts. His years of military training had taught him to remain calm and methodical under pressure. Every decision mattered. Every second counted. He moved to a side panel, quickly scanning the flight path and communication channels. The co-pilot exhaled sharply. "I didn't expect to have to handle this alone," he admitted. "I'm glad you're here." Daniel nodded, his mind already running through options. "We need to stabilize the aircraft first, then maintain communication with air traffic control. I can assist with navigation and monitor systems. You focus on controlling the plane for now." The co-pilot's hands were steady but tense. He adjusted the yoke and throttle, responding to Daniel's instructions. The plane dipped and swayed with each gust of wind, but Daniel's calm presence in the cockpit brought a sense of order to the chaos. Back in the cabin, passengers were unaware of the details. Some noticed the plane had stopped shaking as violently. Some noticed the engine's pitch had changed slightly, but none knew who was behind it. All they could do was wait, hope, and trust that something was being done to guide them safely. Daniel's mind was sharp, focused. He ran through the protocols mentally, recalling every flight he had taken, every maneuver he had learned during his military service. Years of experience, years of pressure, years of training. All of it came together now. The plane was large, heavier than the aircrafts he had flown before, but the principles were the same. Patience, precision, control. He spoke calmly to the co-pilot, giving clear, concise instructions. They adjusted the plane's altitude slightly to avoid a cluster of turbulent clouds. He monitored the instruments, double-checking each reading and anticipating the next move. The co-pilot responded quickly, following Daniel's lead, relief slowly replacing tension in his eyes. In the cabin, a child's soft whimper broke the quiet. A mother leaned over to soothe her daughter, whispering comforting words. A man near the window gripped the armrest tightly, still unsure what was happening but sensing that someone was in control. Daniel's mind remained fully in the cockpit, but he remembered those passengers. Every person mattered. Every life mattered. That knowledge gave him strength, a quiet determination that rose from deep within. Outside, the clouds pressed against the aircraft, rolling and churning like waves in a stormy sea. Inside, the hum of the engines was steady now, controlled. Daniel's calm voice directed adjustments, minor corrections that made a huge difference. The plane leveled slightly, and the violent shakes lessened. Minutes felt like hours. Each adjustment had to be precise. One wrong move could make the situation worse. Daniel's focus never wavered. His hands moved smoothly over the panels, his eyes scanning every indicator. He recalled the many missions he had flown in the past, the times he had faced danger with a team relying on him. Those experiences taught him to stay composed, Even when everything around him seemed chaotic, he drew on that discipline now, quietly and efficiently. The co-pilot, once tense and overwhelmed, began to relax slightly. He trusted Daniel's expertise, knowing that this man had done this before under far more dangerous circumstances. He followed instructions carefully, letting Daniel take the lead. Back in the cabin, some passengers were beginning to sense a change. The plane's movement had become smoother, the sudden dips less severe. Whispers replaced fearful murmurs. People looked out the windows at the clouds, hoping for a sign that the turbulence would pass. Daniel's calm energy radiated through the cockpit. Every decision was measured, every adjustment deliberate. He knew that the passengers didn't need to understand the technical details. They needed reassurance, control, someone who could handle the situation. And so he did what he had always done in moments like this. He focused on the task, one step at a time, using experience, knowledge, and intuition. He glanced at the co-pilot, who nodded slightly. No words were necessary. Both men understood the priority. Keep the plane stable, keep the passengers safe. Outside, the plane began to rise above the roughest part of the turbulence. The clouds that had pressed against the aircraft now appeared less threatening, and the bright sunlight began to pierce through gaps in the white sky. Inside, Daniel allowed himself a brief moment to take a slow breath. It was a small gesture, but it reminded him that even in the middle of crisis, he could stay centered. Passengers in cabin, still unaware of who was guiding them, began to relax slightly. Some whispered prayers. Others simply sat in silence, their hands unclenching as the plane steadied. A few looked at the window and smiled faintly, feeling the movement of the aircraft become less jarring. Daniel did not let his attention wander. He continued to monitor every gauge, every reading. He adjusted the plane's heading slightly to avoid pockets of turbulence still ahead. Each movement was careful, precise. The flight attendant returned briefly to the cabin, walking down the aisles and checking on passengers. She noticed that the shaking had decreased and gave a small nod of reassurance to the nervous travelers. Daniel had not been in the cabin, but his actions were already making a difference. As the plane continued on its path, Daniel maintained steady control. His experience, discipline, and calm demeanor ensured that the aircraft moved safely through the difficult skies. He didn't seek recognition. He didn't need applause. His goal was simple: keep everyone alive, get them through the storm. And as he worked, a quiet thought came to him. He was doing this not for himself, not for anyone's praise, but because he knew what it meant to be responsible for others. Every passenger, every family, every individual on this plane mattered. For Daniel, that was enough. The flight attendant guided Daniel to the cockpit with quick, careful steps. Her expression was tense but relieved. She gave him a brief nod, then stepped back to allow him to enter. Daniel took a deep breath and stepped inside. The cockpit smelled faintly of electronics and the recycled air from the cabin. Screens and instruments glowed softly, reflecting off the glass in front of the pilots. The co-pilot's hands were tense on the controls, his eyes focused on the instruments, clearly feeling the weight of responsibility alone. Daniel's eyes quickly scanned the room. He noted the altitude, speed, and direction. He checked the fuel gauge, the navigation system, and the warning alerts. Every piece of information mattered, and he absorbed it all in a few moments, like reading a familiar map. He took a slow, steadying breath. Then he spoke, calm but firm. "Let's stabilize the plane first. I'll monitor the systems, and you handle controls. We need to make sure our path is clear and the turbulence doesn't get worse." The co-pilot nodded. Relief flashed across his face. "Thank you. I didn't know how I was going to handle this on my own." Daniel moved to the side panel, his hands steady, and began adjusting the navigation instruments. He checked each system twice, making small corrections and keeping a careful watch on the radar. His years of flying in high-pressure situations had taught him to stay calm, think clearly, and act decisively. Outside the cockpit, the clouds churned like white mountains, rolling and shifting in the early sunlight. The plane dipped and shook slightly as it moved through pockets of turbulence. Daniel's hand rested lightly on the console, and his eyes never left the instruments. He spoke in short, clear sentences, directing the co-pilot with confidence. "Adjust the throttle slightly. Turn 2 degrees to the right. Maintain altitude. Watch the left wing. There's a strong draft from that side. The co-pilot followed the instructions, and slowly, the plane began to stabilize. The violent shakes lessened, replaced by smaller, manageable movements. Daniel's calm presence filled the cockpit with quiet authority. He did not rush, he did not panic, and that steadiness allowed the co-pilot to breathe more easily. Back in the cabin, passengers had no idea who was in control. They only noticed that the plane seemed less chaotic. Some whispered prayers. Others simply stared at the window, watching the clouds pass. A few children, sensing the calmer movement, stopped crying, their parents offering quiet reassurance. Daniel worked methodically. He scanned every alert, listening carefully to the communications from air traffic control. He double-checked the weather updates and adjusted their path slightly to avoid more turbulent areas. Each decision was precise, each move deliberate. He spoke calmly to the co-pilot, giving instructions in short bursts. Check the altimeter. We're slightly higher than expected. Adjust down slowly. Watch the speed. Don't overcompensate. Minutes passed, tense but steady. The plane leveled out, the passengers beginning to sense the change. The hum of conversation slowly returned to the cabin, although cautious and quiet. Some people looked around, puzzled by the sudden calm, while others simply held their children closer, grateful for the relief. Daniel glanced at the co-pilot. The younger man looked tired, but less anxious now. Daniel gave a small nod, a silent reassurance that they were moving in the right direction. The co-pilot responded with a subtle smile, relief evident in his eyes. The flight attendant returned to the cockpit, watching Daniel work. She could see his focus, the way he anticipated problems before they happened, the way he spoke calmly and clearly. She gave a small nod, impressed by his quiet confidence. Daniel's mind was sharp. He thought about every maneuver, every possible complication. He had flown in dangerous situations before, but this was different. There were passengers, families, children, and lives in his hands. The responsibility weighed on him, but he did not falter. He reached for the controls gently, making minor adjustments. The plane's angle changed subtly, responding to experience and instinct. The violent movements that had shaken the cabin earlier were now mostly gone. The engines hummed steadily, and the aircraft moved more smoothly through the sky. Outside, sunlight broke through the clouds, casting soft beams over the wing. Daniel allowed himself a brief glance at the sky. It was beautiful, almost peaceful, despite the tension that had filled the last hour. He remembered his daughter. The thought gave him strength. He wanted to reach her safely, to feel the relief of seeing her smile, to hold her in his arms again. That thought sharpened his focus even more. Daniel continued to monitor every system. He checked fuel levels, navigation instruments, and engine performance. Each reading confirmed that the plane was returning to stability. He spoke calmly to the co-pilot, giving directions with quiet authority, helping him regain confidence. In the cabin, the passengers began to notice a change. Whispers turned to murmurs of relief. Parents smiled faintly at their children. People looked out the window, seeing the sky clear and the sunlight brighten clouds. Some reached for their phones, sending short messages of reassurance to loved ones. The flight attendant moved down the aisle again, checking on passengers, offering smiles, and speaking quietly to calm fears. Daniel's work in the cockpit had already made a difference, even if the people in the cabin didn't know it. Daniel never paused in the cockpit. He continued to guide the plane, adjusting the path, watching the instruments and speaking calmly. His focus was unwavering. He thought about every possible scenario, every potential problem, and he acted before issues could arise. The co-pilot, once tense and uncertain, now moved with more confidence. He trusted Daniel's experience and knowledge. He followed instructions precisely, letting Daniel take the lead, knowing that the plane was in capable hands. Outside, the turbulence began to fade. The clouds were still thick in places, but manageable. The plane moved through smoother air, responding to Daniel's careful adjustments. The sunlight illuminated the wing, reflecting off the metal and creating a sense of calm in the sky. Daniel allowed himself a moment to breathe. One slow, deep breath, just enough to remind himself that he was human, not just a pilot following procedure. Then he returned his focus fully to the instruments, the plane, and the safety of the passengers. He spoke again, calmly but firmly. We are stabilizing. Keep monitoring your instruments. Adjust heading slightly. We'll avoid the remaining turbulence ahead. The co-pilot nodded, following the instructions with precise movements. Daniel's confidence gave him strength. His calm voice filled the cockpit with a sense of order amidst the chaos. Minutes passed. The plane's movements became smoother and more predictable. The cabin was no longer tense, though passengers still held their belongings tightly, grateful for the change. Some smiled softly at each other, sensing that the danger was passing. Daniel continued to guide the aircraft, keeping a careful watch on the skies and instruments. He adjusted altitude, speed, and heading as needed, always thinking 2 steps ahead. His years of training, his experience under pressure, and his quiet determination all combined to bring the plane back under control. The flight attendant returned to the cockpit once more, looking at Daniel with respect. She could see his focus, his calm authority, and the way he handled the situation. She stepped back, knowing he had it covered. Daniel glanced at the co-pilot, who was now breathing more easily, hands steady on the controls. They exchanged a small nod, a silent understanding. The plane was stabilizing, the passengers were safe, and the crisis was slowly coming under control. Outside, the clouds shifted, revealing patches of blue sky. The sun shone brighter, casting warm light over the wings. Daniel allowed himself a brief smile, a quiet acknowledgement that their careful work was paying off. The passengers in the cabin began to sense the difference. The turbulence had lessened significantly, and the plane moved more smoothly. Conversation slowly returned, though quiet, and parents comforted their children, whispering reassurances. The atmosphere lightened, a small but noticeable change. Daniel's mind remained sharp, his attention focused. He continued to monitor the instruments, guide the co-pilot, and make minor adjustments. Every move mattered. Every decision had consequences, and he remained fully aware of the responsibility he carried. The plane leveled completely, the engines humming steadily. The co-pilot looked at Daniel with quiet gratitude, realizing how much his calm and experience had helped. Daniel allowed himself one final deep breath in the cockpit. He felt a sense of control returning, a quiet reassurance that the plane and its passengers were safe. But he knew the journey was not over. There was still more work to be done, more careful attention required, and he remained fully alert, ready for whatever came next. He thought of his daughter again, imagining her waiting for him, her laughter, her smile. That thought gave him strength, determination, and focus. He would get through this, not for recognition, not for praise, but for every life on board and for the reunion that awaited him. Daniel continued to guide the co-pilot with steady, calm instructions. Every adjustment, every minor correction brought the plane closer to stability. The turbulence still roared outside, but the aircraft moved more predictably now. He knew that the passengers, although unaware of the details, were beginning to feel safer. The co-pilot finally relaxed slightly. He trusted Daniel's experience. He realized that the quiet man who had boarded just a few hours earlier was handling the situation with the same calm precision he had once seen in top pilots during military training. Daniel's presence had shifted the entire dynamic in the cockpit. Daniel spoke clearly, giving short, precise commands. Maintain current altitude for the next few minutes. Monitor wind speed from the right. Adjust heading by 3 degrees to the left once we clear the clouds ahead. He worked methodically, knowing that small errors could have serious consequences. His hands moved over controls with familiarity, but his mind was always calculating the next step, always prepared for sudden changes. Every system, every instrument, every alert was part of a complex puzzle he had solved countless times before. The co-pilot, once tense and overwhelmed, now moved with confidence. He followed Daniel's guidance, trusting his instructions completely. The plane responded well. It leveled. The engines hummed steadily, and the violent shakes of earlier were almost gone. Daniel allowed himself a brief glance outside. The clouds, once threatening and chaotic, began to thin. Sunlight streamed through in scattered rays, illuminating the wing. For a moment, there was a strange calm, almost like a pause in the storm, and Daniel felt a quiet sense of control. He thought back to his past. There had been many missions, many flights under extreme pressure, where every decision could mean life or death. That experience was now guiding him, giving him the clarity and calm to manage this crisis. But this flight was different. It was not just about skill. It was about responsibility. Each life on this plane mattered, and he carried that weight quietly without complaint. The co-pilot spoke softly, a note of relief in his voice. "I've never been through anything like this alone. You make it seem manageable." Daniel nodded, his eyes still on the instruments. "We've trained for emergencies. Now we just follow the procedure and adjust carefully. The passengers will remain safe if we stay focused." He glanced at the screen showing the aircraft systems. Fuel, engine temperature, navigation, communication channels. All stable. He double-checked each reading, then returned to guiding the co-pilot through minor adjustments. Daniel's thoughts briefly returned to his daughter. The image of her smiling face gave him strength, reminding him why he had made this flight, why he had endured long nights of work and separation. That motivation didn't distract him. It sharpened his focus. He wanted to make it to her safely, but first, he had to get everyone on the plane through this safely. The plane moved into a smoother layer of air. The violent turbulence had mostly passed. Daniel made minor adjustments to altitude and heading, keeping the aircraft steady. Outside, patches of blue sky appeared, the sun casting a warm glow over the metal wings. Back in the cabin, passengers began to notice the change. Whispers of relief replaced tense murmurs. Parents smiled faintly, holding their children closer, grateful for the relative calm. People glanced at each other, sensing that the worst had passed, though none of them knew exactly who had made the difference. Daniel continued to guide the co-pilot. He explained each adjustment clearly, keeping the atmosphere in the cockpit focused but calm. "We are clearing the rough area. Once we pass this patch, we can maintain a smoother altitude for the remainder of the flight." The co-pilot nodded, hands steady on the controls. He began to feel the confidence return, knowing he was not alone in handling the aircraft. Daniel's quiet leadership had brought him calm in the midst of chaos. Daniel's mind ran through each possibility. He anticipated shifts in wind, calculated the effects of altitude changes, and monitored engine performance. His experience under extreme pressure allowed him to act decisively without hesitation. He did not rush, he did not panic, and he did not make mistakes. Outside, sunlight reflected off clouds and the plane's wing. The sky looked peaceful now, a stark contrast to the chaos moments ago. Daniel allowed himself a small, quiet smile, recognizing the progress. The plane was responding well to the careful adjustments, and the path ahead looked clear. He thought back to his past life as a military pilot. Those experiences had taught him how to remain calm when danger seemed overwhelming, how to make decisions quickly, and how to act decisively under pressure. All of those lessons were now keeping the passengers safe. Yet, he never sought recognition for it. The work itself, the responsibility, was reward enough. The co-pilot spoke again, voice quieter now, less tense. "I can see now why you were chosen for critical missions. This calm, precise approach, it's remarkable." Daniel gave a small nod, eyes scanning the instruments. "Focus on controls. That's all that matters right now. We'll get through this together." Minutes passed as the plane continued through the smoother air. Daniel monitored every gauge, every alert, every possible change. The aircraft responded perfectly to the adjustments. He allowed himself a few moments of reflection, remembering the countless hours of training and experience that had prepared him for this exact situation. The passengers remained unaware of the full details, but they sensed a change. The plane no longer shook violently. The engines hummed steadily. The cabin atmosphere relaxed. People whispered quietly, holding their belongings and comforting children. Relief was growing, but no one knew who was responsible. Daniel spoke softly to the co-pilot, giving clear instructions for minor adjustments. "Maintain this heading. Keep a steady climb. Monitor wind from the right side." Everything else looked stable. The co-pilot followed every word, adjusting as instructed. The plane leveled completely, moving smoothly through the sky. The tension that had filled the cockpit earlier was replaced by quiet focus and steady control. Daniel allowed himself another glance at the sky outside. Sunlight streamed through the clouds, highlighting the metal of the wing. It was a calm and peaceful scene, a stark contrast to the moments of chaos that had come earlier. For a brief moment, he felt the satisfaction of control and the quiet reassurance that he was guiding everyone safely. He thought again of his daughter, the reason he had made this flight. The thought of seeing her gave him strength and motivation, but it did not distract him. He remained focused on the immediate responsibility, the lives on the plane, and the safety of every passenger. The flight attendant returned briefly to the cockpit, watching Daniel at work. She could see the calm authority in his movements, the precision of his adjustments, and a quiet focus that had stabilized the situation. She stepped back, confident that he had the situation under control. Daniel continued to guide the co-pilot, adjusting instruments and monitoring systems. He remained vigilant, knowing that unexpected issues could still arise. His calm presence kept the co-pilot focused and steady. Together, they moved the plane to the remaining rough air, guiding it towards safer skies. The turbulence faded completely, leaving the plane gliding smoothly. Outside, the sun shone brightly, clouds scattered and calm. The aircraft moved steadily, engines humming in consistent rhythm. Daniel allowed himself a small sigh of relief, knowing that the most dangerous part of the flight was behind them. In the cabin, passengers began to notice a change. Whispers of relief replaced tension. Parents hugged their children, offering quiet reassurance. People exchanged soft smiles, sensing that the worst was over. They still did not know who had guided them through the chaos, but the sense of safety was clear. Daniel remained focused, guiding the plane carefully. He gave clear instructions to the co-pilot, made minor adjustments, and monitored the systems continuously. His calm authority ensured that the plane remained safe, stable, and on course. The co-pilot, now confident and steady, followed Daniel's lead without hesitation. He could feel the difference that Daniel's experience and composure made. Together, they guided the plane to the final patches of turbulence, ensuring that the passengers would reach their destination safely. Daniel allowed himself one final moment to glance at the sky outside. Sunlight bathed the clouds in gold and white, a peaceful scene that promised safety and calm. The plane moved smoothly, responding perfectly to every adjustment. He felt a quiet sense of satisfaction, knowing that his actions had protected the lives of everyone on board. He thought of his daughter once more, imagining her smiling face waiting for him at the airport. That thought gave him strength, focus, and determination. But he remained calm, grounded, and fully aware of his responsibility in the cockpit. The plane moved steadily, the engines humming reliably. The turbulence was gone, replaced by smooth air and clear skies. Daniel continued to monitor the systems, adjust minor controls, and ensure that every aspect of flight remained safe. He had done his job well, and the lives of the passengers were secure because of his calm, careful guidance. The plane had finally entered a smooth stretch of sky, the kind that made passengers feel as if the turbulence had never existed. Daniel continued to monitor every instrument in the cockpit, though the immediate danger had passed. His eyes were sharp, his focus unwavering. He knew that the flight still required careful attention, but for the first time, there was room for quiet confidence. The co-pilot exhaled, relaxing slightly, but his hands never left the controls. He glanced at Daniel with a mixture of relief and awe. The quiet man who had appeared so ordinary just a few hours ago had completely transformed the situation. The steady calm in the cockpit was a sharp contrast to the chaos that had existed earlier. Outside the plane, the sun reflected brightly off the wings, casting long shadows across the clouds. The turbulence was gone, replaced by the soft hum of the engines and the gentle motion of smooth air. Daniel allowed himself a small smile. It was a rare, quiet acknowledgement of the control he had regained over the situation. Back in the cabin, passengers had begun to sense the difference. Whispers of relief replaced fearful murmurs. Children who had been clinging to their parents now relaxed slightly, looking around at the calming atmosphere. Parents shared small smiles, recognizing the change in the plane's movement. The cabin itself seemed to exhale collectively. The flight attendants walked down the aisles, quietly checking on passengers, offering reassurance. Some noticed people relaxing their grip on armrests. Others simply smiled, grateful that the tension had eased. But no one yet knew who had been responsible for the change. All they knew was that the plane was now steady, moving safely toward its destination. Daniel remained in the cockpit, methodically guiding the co-pilot through minor adjustments. He spoke in calm, clear sentences, ensuring every movement of the plane was precise. Maintain current altitude. Keep heading steady. Monitor speed and fuel levels. All systems stable so far. The co-pilot followed the instructions carefully, hands steady, eyes on the instruments. He had regained confidence under Daniel's quiet command. The difference was obvious. The plane was no longer at the mercy of turbulence, but moving as it should, under control. Daniel thought again of his daughter, the reason for this flight. The thought made his resolve even stronger. Every life on board mattered, but his personal motivation gave him an inner strength that was hard to describe. He knew that reaching her safely was a priority, but he never let it distract him from his responsibility to all the passengers. Minutes passed, and the plane continued its smooth flight. Daniel's focus was complete, but he allowed himself a brief moment to glance at the sky outside. The sunlight painted the clouds with soft gold and white shades, a scene so calm it almost felt unreal after the turbulence they had passed through. The co-pilot, now fully confident, spoke quietly. I can see why you were trusted with high-pressure missions. Your calm and precise instructions make all the difference. Daniel nodded, still focused on the instruments. We've trained for emergencies. It's not about skill alone. It's about composure and careful action. That's what keeps everyone safe. Outside, the plane approached its descent path. Daniel guided the co-pilot through careful adjustments for landing. They maintained communication with air traffic control, ensuring that the runway would be clear and ready. The careful coordination was necessary, but by now, the worst of the turbulence was behind them. Passengers could feel the change in the aircraft's movement. There were small bumps as the plane descended, but it was controlled, smooth. A few passengers whispered quietly, realizing they were about to land safely. A mother held her child's hand tightly, but smiled softly, while another passenger let out a quiet sigh of relief. Daniel spoke calmly to the co-pilot as they approached the runway. Reduce speed gradually. Align with the center line. We'll maintain steady descent and touch down smoothly. The co-pilot followed precisely, and together they guided the plane down safely. The wheels touched the runway with a gentle thump, the engines braking steadily. The passengers felt a controlled landing, a stark contrast to the panic of earlier. The aircraft slowed, taxiing smoothly toward the gate. In the cabin, a collective sense of relief washed over everyone. Passengers clapped quietly, some laughing softly, some hugging their companions. A few looked around, trying to understand who had ensured their safety, but the identity of the quiet hero in row 10 remained unknown. Daniel stayed in the cockpit for a moment, monitoring the systems as the plane taxied. Then he finally allowed himself to breathe a little deeper. The immediate danger had passed. The plane was safe, and the passengers were secure. The flight attendant opened the cockpit door and looked at him, a soft smile of gratitude on her face. You did an incredible job. Everyone on board owes you their thanks, she said quietly. Daniel gave a small nod, brushing off the praise. Recognition had never been his motivation. His only concern was getting through the flight safely and reaching his daughter. He finally returned to his seat in row 10. Passengers looked up curiously, noticing the quiet man who had been asleep for much of the flight. Some assumed he was tired from a long day. Some simply ignored him. Little did they know that the man sitting quietly by the window had just helped save everyone on board. The plane came to a stop at the gate. Passengers began to gather their belongings, preparing to disembark. The atmosphere was calm, grateful, and relieved. Some passengers shared stories quietly among themselves, expressing thanks to the flight attendants for their professionalism. Daniel retrieved his small backpack, checking briefly for the music box and the photo of his daughter. Everything was as he had left it. A soft smile crossed his face. Soon he would see her. Soon, the exhaustion of long nights and the stress of the flight would be replaced by the joy of reunion. As he stood to leave, a few passengers looked at him with curiosity. Some remembered the earlier turbulence and wondered who had remained calm throughout. One elderly man nodded at him, a small gesture of unspoken thanks. Daniel gave a quiet nod in return, acknowledging gratitude without making a scene. He walked down the aisle slowly, careful not to rush. Flight attendants moved efficiently, assisting passengers as they disembarked. The sounds of rolling luggage, soft conversation, and footsteps filled the space. Outside the plane, the tarmac was bright with sunlight, the city waiting for its visitors. Daniel stepped down the stairs and onto the tarmac. The warm morning air touched his face, and he took a deep breath. For a moment, he simply paused, letting the calm and relief wash over him. He had carried the responsibility of dozens of lives and succeeded. Now, he could carry himself forward to the most important person in his life, his daughter. He walked toward the terminal, carrying his small backpack and the photo of his daughter. Each step felt lighter, the weight of the past hours finally easing. The chaos, the turbulence, the fear, it was all behind him now. What mattered was a reunion waiting at the end. Passengers continued to exit the plane, some still discussing the flight, others quietly relieved. A few glanced at Daniel as he moved past, still unaware of his role. But for him, it didn't matter. The important thing was that they were all safe and that he had done everything he could to make that happen. Inside the terminal, he saw the familiar figure of his daughter waiting. Her eyes lit up when she saw him, and she ran toward him without hesitation. Daniel dropped his bag briefly to scoop her into his arms, holding her tightly. Her laughter and excited chatter filled the space, a sound he had been missing for months. For Daniel, all the tension, fear, and exhaustion melted away in that moment. The flight, the turbulence, the responsibility, they all led to this. The safety of the passengers and the joy of reunion combined into a quiet, profound satisfaction. He whispered softly to his daughter, holding her close. "I'm here now. I'm never letting go again." She smiled up at him, her small hands gripping his shoulders, completely unaware of the chaos he had guided them through. Behind them, passengers and flight attendants moved through the terminal, carrying on with their day. Few would ever know the full story of the quiet man who had been asleep in row 10, who had become the unexpected hero of the flight. Daniel, holding his daughter, walked through the terminal doors into the sunlight. The airport buzzed around them, full of travelers and noise, but he only focused on her. In that moment, nothing else mattered. The story of the quiet janitor in row 10 would remain largely unknown to the world, but for Daniel, the knowledge of what he'd done, and the reunion with his daughter, was more than enough. He had faced fear, responsibility, and pressure with calm and care, and he had succeeded. And as they walked together through the terminal, hand in hand, the memory of the flight, the turbulence, the fear, the quiet determination would stay with him forever, a reminder of what it meant to be responsible, calm, and devoted when lives depended on him. The hero in row 10 was no longer just a passenger. He was a man who had quietly saved lives, returned to his daughter, and reminded himself of the strength and resilience that lay within him.